So I finished Dominion, The Making of a Western Mind by Tom Holland. Not the actor, but the historian. So he says it's not, but it's kind of a history of Christianity, split into three parts. Antiquity, Christendom, and Modernitas. So sort of the classical age, the medieval age, and the modern age. But it's kind of a history, but it's kind of an overview, but it's kind of showing how Christianity has changed and how in the modern Western world, a lot of what we take for granted about our supposedly secular culture is still very much Christian or rooted in Christianity. So it's a very large book, so I have a lot of notes here, so I'm going to go chapter by chapter and try and summarize it. So the first chapter is called Athens. That talks about the pre-Christian philosophers like the Stoics and Aristotle who are searching for a God that is rational, or rationality in the universe. And that's sort of the first little ingredient of what becomes Christianity. Chapter 2, Jerusalem, focuses on the Jewish tradition, the Torah, their exile in Babylon, and their covenant with one God. Now it says that their God might have initially been part of a pantheon, maybe the dominant one in that pantheon, but they sort of eventually became monotheistic and settled on this one God. And that could probably be part of their exile in Babylon and their freedom by the Persians and the interaction with that Zoroastrian culture. The monotheistic Zoroastrianism might have influenced their shift to monotheism. And also maybe their shift to a linear view of time as opposed to cyclical, which the Zoroastrians also ascribe to. But we'll get to that much later in this overview, summary. So they have a covenant with this one God, the Israelites. So most all other cultures have sort of a pantheon of gods or have various gods that are sort of above them. Don't really care about humanity, or they sort of mingle with humanity, but the Israelites are special because they have an actual deal with their God, literally written down on stone tablets, like a literal written contract with their God. And they also have holy texts, so the Torah, which allows them to worship outside of their temple. So they have one main temple to their God, but with their holy texts they can worship outside of it, which allows for a Jewish diaspora or Israelite at this point. So like in Alexandria, a very Greek city, Hellenistic city, there's a big Jewish population there, Israelite, whatever, and they can still worship and be Jewish there. So the third chapter, mission. So we're after Christ at this point. Interesting, he doesn't really speak much about Jesus of Nazareth in this book, because we had the Jewish and now we're going straight past it to Paul. So Paul's spreading Christianity throughout the Roman world. He's freeing them from the laws of Moses, but there's still some rules. He's like, well, yeah, we're all free from the law. We don't have to follow the rules anymore. We just have to. Then he's like, well, wait, actually, because of the way I was raised, some things I don't really like. I think it was the Corinthians. So the church at Corinth was like, we can do whatever we want. Cool, let's do all this crazy stuff. And Paul's like, whoa, no, actually, I'm going to have some rules. Okay, we actually can't do this. So mutually beneficial rules, divine laws. They're not Paul's laws, but they're laws relating to women and sexuality. So he's like, we're all equal. We're all free in Christ. But actually, women are subordinate to men. It's like, okay, Paul, sure. So Christianity has become this syncretic religion of Greek philosophical thought, and Judaism. And then chapter 4, belief, which is early Christians sorting out their doctrine, determining what is and isn't canon, which the word canon, it's an instrument for making a straight line, like with chalk. So there's a lot of etymology in this book, which I find I love etymology. So like learning what the word canon means, where that comes from. So the writing of the gospel accounts happens at this point, compiling them into the Holy Scriptures. The word orthodoxy means true path. The word Catholic means universal. So there's a universal church that is on a true path, using canon to help them find that true path. Then the Donatist schism, which I don't really remember much about the Donatists. I think they were the first that were kind of against the authority of a church. Not that the church had much authority at this point, but they were, I think they were very much more individualistic, which is starting a trend that carries on all the way to Martin Luther. And then, of course, we have Constantine, who brings the Roman administration to the cult, and the Council/Creed of Nicaea, where Constantine gets all the church members together and says, okay, we're going to hammer out this canon and determine what's true and what's not true. So the next chapter is called Charity. So the rich, usually in the classical world, the rich would build vast public monuments to themselves as sort of a gift to the public to build their prestige and whatnot. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. Instead, they donate money to the church, and the church is seen to look after the poor. So the church gets lots of money from the wealthy and just is the distributing, kind of like how the government functions now, where the government taxes a lot of people and uses that money for public goods. Well, that's what the church is doing in this early state. And he talks about Julian the Apostate, who's very interesting because he was raised as a Christian. However, he's the Roman emperor. However, he wants to go back to what we call pagan. He wants to go back to he doesn't want to be a Christian. He wants to worship the old gods, the old Roman gods. And so Julian, he meets some priests of Cybele, and he's shocked that they're not helping the poor. He's like, the poor are suffering here, and you guys aren't helping them, you priest of Cybele. And they're like, what do you mean? We're the priest of Cybele. Why would we help the poor? And it's interesting because he assumes that, raised as a Christian, that's what the priests do. They help the poor, but that wasn't the case in pre-Christian Rome. So we have saints being venerated like the dead emperors once were, and there was originally some who called for the abolishment of slavery and wealth in common, but that did not last, as plutocratic Christians found excuses to keep their wealth. So even in this very early stage, if we're seeing all people are equal and we should be giving money to the poor, then why don't we hold all wealth in common? And why don't we, what was the other thing? Get rid of slavery. How can we have slavery if everyone's equal? But those are took a couple thousand years for those to sort of percolate and get through. Because slavery was just a way of life. They couldn't imagine a world without it. So the next chapter is called Heaven. There's more etymology. I wrote this down at this point. I found the sentence structures to kind of be difficult to read because there's lots of sort of inset clauses where I'll start a sentence, comma, have basically a whole thought in between, and then comma, finish the first sentence. And it took a while for me to get the hang of his writing, because he would do that with very long sentences and sort of sentences within sentences. But anyways, so heaven, we have talked about angels, St. Michael, the afterlife. So Plato's idea of an immortal soul was co-opted by Augustine, one of the early church fathers. Interesting that he mentions the Christians disgust at pagan blood sacrifices, but I'm thinking if they come from a Jewish tradition, and Paul came from a Jewish tradition, like they had sacrifices at the temple daily, blood sacrifices. So it's interesting that they don't. Maybe they didn't like those blood sacrifices as well. But I mean, the whole premise of Christianity is that Jesus was the ultimate blood sacrifice. But anyways, I thought it interesting that he mentioned that without mentioning the other aspects of blood sacrifice in Christianity. And then he talks here about the linear history versus cyclical, where most societies have a cyclical understanding of history, of death and rebirth, cycles, seasons, years, generations, sort of what goes around comes around. But Christians, and I think Zoroastrians were the first, have a beginning of the world. I mean, most cultures have a beginning of the world, but a beginning and an end. So the beginning and apocalypse, Armageddon. So a very linear view of history compared to the cyclical. So the next chapter, Exodus, we have Islam on the scene. So Islam's pushed Christianity out of all the old Christian heartlands of Syria, Palestine, and Africa. It's sort of driven a wedge between the East and the West of the Roman Empire. We have Charles the Hammer Martel, who beat the Muslims at the Battle of Poitiers, kept them out of what is now France, kept them in Iberia. And then Pepin, a descendant of Charles Martel, and maybe his son, was congratulated by Pope Paul I, which aligned Rome more with what became France, with the Franks, rather than with the Constantinople. So yeah, that's sort of the separating from East and West. I don't know if this is the origin of this schism, but it was apparent by this point. So in the next chapter, conversion, we have militarism in Eastern Europe. So this is the Germanic and Slavic, not tribes, peoples. So conversion by Charlemagne at sword point, conversion of pagan rulers who saw becoming part of Christianity as a means to greater wealth, power. So there's some were hedging their bets, like, oh, there's this other god and he's super powerful, because Charlemagne's conquering all this stuff. So maybe if I get that god on my side, I can be powerful like Charlemagne. Also, the sort of, I think it's Dan Carlin who says the just add Jesus, and you can get literacy, you can get chronicles, you can get building. All this stuff can be incorporated in your kingdom. Just add Jesus. So a lot of people are becoming Christian in Northern Europe, but most at sword point by Charlemagne. And of course, in Christmas Day, year 800, we have Charlemagne being crowned emperor by the Pope, the defender of Latin Christianity, seen as the new Roman emperor, which really separates the East from the West. So moving right along, we've got Revolution, the next chapter, which is about, I think it's Gregory VII at this point, who sees himself, the Pope, as the head of a state, the state of Christendom, superior to kings and emperors. This is a kingdom of God that is sort of over top of all secular, I'll use that word now, powers. And also a militant faith. So if he has a state, he's going to have an army. So that's the Crusades. Also the codifying and discovery of laws. So they've sort of, some scholars have discovered old Roman laws, and they're kind of co-opting them into Christianity and using them as laws of Christendom, but they're Roman. At this point, priests become celibate. Universities pop up to sort of discover, study these laws and logic, natural laws and philosophy, all for the church's benefit. So the first universities were just to train priests to manage to deal with canon law and whatnot. So papal authority, the Pope has lots of authority now. He can condemn heresies and heretics, which and also excommunicate people. So that's all sort of happening at this point. Next chapter, persecution. So you have the Inquisitors, who actively hunt down heretics. Used to be that they just sort of left them on their own and condemned them, but now they're actually created this faction to go out and search them down. And we have the Cathars, who they're not actually Cathars. I think they're Albigensians, but they are basically Christians that sort of missed out on this new Reformation, this new Papal Revolution, where the Pope has gained so much power and become such the head of state, essentially. So in all these sort of isolated rural places, Christians, are just sort of carrying out their life and their religion as they always have. But because they haven't been sort of in tune with the rest of Christendom, they seem like heretics. And so the Catholic Church authorities go and wipe them out. Then we have the Waldensians, who preach various asceticism, sort of giving away all their wealth and living as monks, kind of, but they're seen as sort of, they are persecuted. But then the Franciscans come along and kind of do the same thing, and they're given a papal mandate, actually. So the Pope's like, well, wait a minute, we can't just, okay, you can be the Franciscans and go off in your monasteries and have your weird ascetic monk life. So with the Christian conquest of Toledo, so the Reconquista of Iberia is happening. They're pushing the Muslims out of Iberia. They discover some works of Aristotle in the 13th century that they haven't seen before, and which really brings Aristotelian philosophy and logic into Christendom. Thomas Aquinas is very important in integrating and synthesizing Christianity with Aristotelian philosophy. At this point, the persecution of the Jews is really picking up in Europe, and eventually they're expelled from most of Europe. And interestingly, the translation of the Quran is first translated into Latin, but it's seen as the ultimate heresy. So next chapter, Flesh, talks about the subjugation of women, which comes in part from Aristotle, who said that women were unfinished men. There's a huge focus on marriage. At this point, marriage becomes the center of the family, not a patriarch controlling a vast extended family, but in fact a marriage of two, a man and a woman, becoming the center of a family, of a household. And norms of sexuality are formalized from this as well. And it's seen as only something that can occur in a marriage between a man and a woman. And so they have to come up with a word to describe people who have sexual relations outside of this man-woman two-person marriage. And so they, using the ancient texts about Sodom and Gomorrah, they call it sodomy for the first time. And it's the idea was so anathema to everyone that they had to invent a word for it, because before this it was just, you just have sexual relations. Why do we need a label to describe some things and not other things? They're all sort of the same. But it's at this point that there's clear delineations are created by the church as to what is right and proper and what is not. And he also talks about in this chapter how women and femininity are at the same time seen as evil, but also as appreciated and good. Like, for example, from Aristotle, we see that women are to be subjugated by men, but according to Jesus and the Bible, what's become the Bible at this point, like the church is the bride of Christ. Jesus' mother Mary is venerated. There is also Eve tempting Adam, and the blame on Eve for that. But in Christianity, all are supposed to be equal. All are equal in Christ under God. So that includes man and woman. So throughout this whole 2,000-year period, it's interesting the role of women, where if you're true to well, I mean, it depends on what part of Christianity you're true to, but it's sort of, you can go either way and still technically be right. So the next chapter is Apocalypse. So here we have the Black Death, the belief that the end of the world is nigh. Popes are being denounced as antichrists, but the Reconquista is happening. Christianity, the Spanish monarchs are taking back Spain. The New World's being colonized. Christopher Columbus goes over, and that's when we get Martin Luther showing up in the early 1500s. So next chapter is Reformation, which is all about Martin Luther, with who's sort of done, at this point in the book, it's sort of like he is a continuation in a long line of people trying to get away from the hierarchy and authority of the church and the reforms of Gregory VII, and more to a traditional, like starting with the Donatists, all the way, the Albigensians, the Waldensians, all these different people who are trying to get away from the authority of the church, but it's only at Martin Luther's time where it actually succeeds. But it goes sort of beyond Luther's control. He loses control of it, and he sort of renounces it in the end. So basically, I'm just sort of assuming you know about Martin Luther, but he posts 95 theses on his 95 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, saying basically, like, why should we follow the Pope? The Pope's actually, I don't know if he calls the Pope the Antichrist, but there's a lot of that going around at this time. And they see, like, the wealth and the power of the Catholic Church, and they're like, Christianity is all about love and equality, and this is not the done thing. So Martin Luther posts that, and it sort of ignites all over the place. So, for example, John of Leyden, who creates sort of his own little state in Munster, where he's this weird autarch, and I don't know, the Anabaptists at Munster are so strange that Protestants and Catholics team up to go take him out. And we have Jean Calvin, who goes to Geneva, and even though he's not a Swiss or Genevan, citizen, they let him sort of take over this town and not rule it, but help them get on the right path as they see it. So he thinks, he believes in predestination, or that certain people are selected to be the chosen of God and other people aren't. Then we have, of course, Henry VIII, who he really liked this girl Anne Boleyn, but he's like, oh man, hey Pope, can I divorce my wife? I really want to marry this other girl. And the Pope's like, no, you can't marry your wife. Your wife's Catherine of Aragon. She's the aunt of Charles V, the most powerful monarch in Europe at this time. I don't want to get on his bad side. And so Henry VIII's like, well, guess what? Then I'll just defy you, like Martin Luther and all these Protestants are doing, and I'll create my own church, and we'll call it the Anglican Church, and I'm the head of the church, so that means I can give myself a divorce. I think I got that right. Maybe I didn't, but whatever. So that happens in England, that Henry VIII becomes, the monarch of England becomes the head of sort of their own version of the church, somewhere in between Protestant and Catholic, but separate. So Luther wanted to separate the secular rule from the spiritual, allowing spirituality to be individual and liberal, while earthly rule would still be hierarchical and authoritarian. But some wanted total liberty, wanted communism. It's interesting that, not at this point, but throughout this period, it's important to note that the idea of a religion and of secularism, of not just a separation between church and state, but in an individual, separation between your spirituality, what you believe in and what you do in terms of your religion, and non-religious things, other things in your life. So I have trouble explaining it because it doesn't make sense. It was sort of an invented thing that there's a difference between what is religious and what is secular. And I'll get to talking about India and Hinduism later, but I was speaking with a Hindu a few weeks ago, and he was trying to explain it, and he's like, no, it's not a religion, it's just a way of life. Like, but one of the major points in this book is that the separation between the secular and the religion is purely a Christian construct. This is not a sort of a universal thing that we can apply to other religions. But anyways, yeah, so Luther's part of that. So the next part's cosmos. So we talk about the Jesuits, who are people from the Society of Jesus. They go abroad and take on the local culture and bring them Christendom. So they don't try and push their cult, they try and embed themselves in local cultures and use that to spread Christianity. And he talks about the Jesuits in China, which is really interesting because, I mean, at this time, and for most of human history, China has been one of the most advanced states in history, in the world. So at this point at China, they're trying to create a new calendar, and the Chinese astronomers, they don't have a true understanding, I'll say, of the solar system and the universe. So when they're trying to plan for an eclipse, and they get the dates wrong, but it turns out these foreigners, these Christians, get the dates right, and it's like, well, how did they do that? And it's because of their understanding of Copernican and Galilean understandings of the solar system, where a heliocentric understanding. And also they bring a telescope from Galileo to China, and sort of that's how they get in with the emperor. And I think that's probably the first time in history that China, which had been the most advanced society, saw something from outsiders that was more advanced than they were. And it's sort of a hint of things to come horribly for China hundreds of years from this point. So we have the 30 Years' War at this point, from 1618 to 1648, where Germany is just utterly destroyed for an entire generation in a war between Catholics and Protestants, which ends in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which sort of says that, okay, you can't mess with a different state just because of, like, each state can rule itself and they can choose whatever religion they want to choose. We can't be messing with each other, because it's caused too much trouble. We also have the Puritans, the Pilgrims, who don't like England and Anglicanism. They're like, no, we want further Protestant, we're Puritan, we're super far Protestant. So they go off and found a New England at this point in the 1620s. And we also have the English Revolution, Civil War, resulting in the English Republic in Cromwell, who was quite Christian, quite Protestant, I think. I don't have any notes on this, so I'm going to skip this. The next chapter is Spirit, where Protestantism has gone so far that and that religion becomes so individualistic that each individual is entitled to their own beliefs. So it used to be that the Pope was the one who decided the will of God, and everyone else has to believe what the Pope and what the church authorities say. They create the canon, the orthodox, and everyone has to agree with them. But with Protestantism and Martin Luther, he's gone away from that and said, no, it's an individual thing. We can believe individually what we want. But it's gone such to the point where if anyone can believe what they want to be true, then there sort of are no truths to Christianity. It's just whatever is true to the individual. So which creates people like Spinoza, who is basically an atheist, but doesn't come right out and say it. But there's sort of a belief in a more rational world, which goes back to the Stoics and the early Greek philosophers, where they're looking. These people are seeing God in a different way, not as sort of a literal being who sent a literal son, but more as a rational, supreme being that is controlling the universe through these natural laws that can be understood empirically. So that's how that comes about, or starts to. And the Christian fight for the abolition of slavery really picks up at this point as well, which just seems sort of, I mean, slavery has been a thing for all of human history, but for the past, I guess at this point, 1600, 1700 years of Christianity, where we're being told all people are equal, why do we still have slaves? So the next chapters are the Enlightenment, where we have Voltaire and Diderot, who are more atheists, sprung from the freedom from church authority that Martin Luther created. We have the American and French Revolutions. The French Revolution is a stark and violent shift away from the previous Catholic rule with the destruction of all things religious. So France was a Catholic country, but with the French Revolution, it's sort of a pendulum that's been one way Catholic and then swings completely the other way to not even Protestantism, but total, they try and wipe out religion and Christianity. They destroy monasteries and churches and cathedrals. They try and destroy religion, but they create this thing called the sort of human rights. I can't remember, the rights of man and the citizen. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, I think it's called. But all the things they put into that, like strict equality, equality, liberty, fraternity, right? The French Revolution. Those are all very Christian ideals, but they are saying that they are not Christian. They are going against Christianity, but you see what I mean. And the other revolution, the American Revolution, has a radical Protestant values cloaked in Enlightenment philosophy. So it's a continuation of Protestant values of liberty and communal tolerance. So the Protestant pilgrims go over, they settle, they create cities they create New England, but then there's also Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, where it's a tolerant city. They allow all people, even Catholics and Jews, to come in, and they're tolerant of one another. They believe in equality and all these Protestant Christian values. But the American Revolution they see as not as Christian, but as sort of, what are the words they use? I mean, they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, like equality and self-determination and all these things that really aren't self-evident and aren't logical, only are based in Christian values, which is another main point of this whole book that I found really interesting. It's also at this point that the term Middle Ages is popularized, because it's sort of seen that in the classical period, humans there was progress happening. Humans were advancing. And then we get to the Middle Ages, where it was ruled by the church, and humanity was stagnant for that time until we get to the modern era, in which people have thrown off the shackles of the church and we can progress once more. So the Middle Ages was seen as sort of this time in between, which is interesting. We also have the Marquis de Sade at this point. Lovely guy, where we get the word sadism or sadist. So he was a very radical dismissal of human rights. So at this point, we're not going from... So we've allowed such individuality that people can believe whatever they like and still call it Christianity. But that's also freed people to believe whatever they like and go against Christianity, such as the Marquis de Sade, who he dismissed human rights as just baseless and superstitious, just as baseless and as superstitious as Christianity. He argued for the strong to use the weak as was natural. So to him, in the natural world, what's the saying? The weak are meat and the strong do eat. He's like, that's natural. That's I hold those truths to be self-evident. Not this anything about equality or helping out the poor or anything. Those are all superstitious Christian values. And at this point, the slavery was abolished in Europe. There was a big push for that. And also Napoleon showed up, and he wasn't really against slavery because of the whole Haitian thing. But anyways, so the next chapter is religion, which I talked about a bit earlier. So the British in India, this idea of Hinduism as a religion. At first they called the people of India, not Indians, but they called them the Hindus. Because the Hindus didn't have a word for religion or secular. They had no conception of the distinction like Europeans did. And interestingly, India was never Christianized for fear of causing instability and upsets that would reduce income being made off the people. So capitalism is very much in charge here. But India was still Christianized in the sense of its acceptance and the use of the distinction between religion and the secular, which some Indians themselves helped to bring about and use. Just as the British used them, they would use the British by saying like, oh, this sort of thing that we do, well, that's not technically part of Hinduism, so you can actually create a law to abolish that, and then we can get rid of that. So some Indians also use that to shape their world and use the British. So the Jews are finally allowed back into Europe after the French Revolution because equality, right? Everyone's equal. Doesn't matter your religion. Actually, I think they don't want any religions, but yes, they can let the Jews in. They granted them citizenship eventually, but again, the Jews aren't seen as outsiders from another nation of Jews, but as individuals possessing a religion of Judaism, much the same as the Hindus are just Indians with a religion of Hinduism. And even Islam was Christianized to a degree by the imposition by Christians, specifically the British, to eliminate the slave trade. So the British are going around trying to eliminate the slave trade, and the Muslims are like, well, this is our whole way of life is about slavery. Like, read the words of the Prophet, and he's all for slavery. The British are like, no, you're not allowed. So then, much the same as the Hindus, they sort of go back to and they're like, well, actually, the Prophet maybe didn't say that, and maybe that's just something. It's not really actually part of our religion. It's not part of Islam, so I guess we can secularize it and then abolish it to appease the British, who are super powerful at this time. Then we have the chapter Science, which is all about dinosaurs and Darwin and natural selection, which it goes against the Christian ideas of caring for the weak. I mean, it's very natural, much like Marquis de Sade, like the strong prey upon the weak. That's nature, which is very anti-Christian. Marx and Lenin at this time, communism, which still has Christian values, equality, helping out for the poor, holding wealth in common. We also have Carnegie, who's a capitalist who doesn't have so much Christian values, specifically when it comes to charity, though he does donate a lot, but not so much to the poor as to large institutions. I don't know, I'm not really clear on that. But anyways, and of course at this time Kraft Ebing comes up with this portmanteau homosexuality. He invents this new word called homosexuality. Sort of, it's a term invented as a diagnosis, almost a medical term, which the term itself doesn't make sense because homo is Greek and sexuality is Latin, so it's some weird combination of Latin and Greek. Yeah, so he invents this word. They don't use sodomy anymore. They use this new clinical modern word homosexuality to explain things that 2,000 years ago people would have no concept of. They're like, what are you talking about? What do you, a word for this? How is this any different from, anyways. So the last three chapters, Shadow, which is World War One, where both sides demonized each other and sort of thought that they had Christianity on their side. Nietzsche, who argued for the strong controlling the weak, again, a more naturalistic Darwinian view with the natural order, which the Nazis latched onto in World War II and attempted to eliminate religion. They were fully opposed to Christian ideals. They were all about that awful stuff. So the penultimate chapter, Love. We're in the second half of the 20th century at this point. We've got the Beatles, who are atheists but are preaching love and Christian values. We have Martin Luther King, who is very much a Christian, but using those Christian values specifically in the south of the United States, where Protestant Christianity is very strong, but they are very racist. Segregation is a thing. So he's preaching to them like, hey, if you're Christian, we should be following these values of love and acceptance of each other and equality. We're all one. We're all children of God, sort of thing. And then, interestingly, Christianity in Africa was much more vibrant and truer to Christianity than modern European Christianity. So these priests and bishops in Africa would be casting out demons and curing people and causing miracles, and like the modern Catholics in Europe are like, well, you can't be doing. They're like, what are you talking about? Of course we can do this. Like, we're like Christians. That's what Christians do. So South Africa, so Christianity, Christian equality brought down apartheid. We have colonialism and 9/11, the war in Iraq. So Muslims in Iraq and Syria. So, see, as I get closer and closer to more modern times, I'm more sort of I want to be more careful about what I say, but I'm just trying to summarize what he said. So we're just gonna go with it. So Iraq and Syria, they saw Islam as having been corrupted and Christianized over the years by ideals of freedom, equality, charity for the weak and poor. So they're like, all these things, these are Christian things. These aren't Muslim, Islamic things. Why are we doing them? So they sought to reform Islam to its fundamental roots, but they did so, I don't know how to explain this very well, but they did so in a very Protestant manner, according to the author. They ignored scholarly Islamic tradition and instead created a religion of hate, cruelty, and violence. That's the 21st century early Islamic, what we'd call terrorist or terrorist state, where they're using Islam. I mean, they think they're doing, I don't know. Okay, we'll just end it there. But the last chapter, Woke. So this book was published in 2018, I think. So he talks about Charlie Hebdo, which was that place in Paris where they created political cartoons. And they had always traditionally made cartoons making fun of the Pope and Catholicism and like being very sort of offensive. But they had an understanding that of a separation between the secular and the religious. So they could, on the secular side, make fun of the religious, and it was okay, it was fine. They've been doing that for years. But then they decided, hey, you know what? Islam is another religion. We should make fun of them as a religion, but do so in a secular way. And that offended so many people that two gunmen went into the office where these people work, and killed 12 of them. It was a big thing back in whenever it happened, 2014 or whatever. But the author in this book is saying that it's an example of how secularization is Christian and it can't be forced onto other so-called religions. So then there's a little piece about immigration into Europe, which is interesting because it's opposite of the colonial times. So like 100 years previous to this, with all the European empires, we had people from the imperial capitals going out to the colonies and settling and exploiting. But in this case, all the European empires that have abandoned their colonies are fallen to ruin and corruption, and so people are fleeing those and trying to go to these European capitals. And there's a Christian desire to let those people in and help those who need help. And that's Christian, even though they say it's not Christian. But they want these people who are coming in to convert to Christian, aka Western values, so human rights. So basically all human rights stem from Christianity. Another interesting point he says, the conflict between the left and right, which was very much occurring when this book came out in 2018. He says that's not sort of traditional fundamentalist Christians against liberal atheists. They're both promoting different sides of Christian values. So he says it's a civil war between factions of Christianity, which I thought was really interesting. So humanism is just Christian values in an atheistic mask. So these ideas of human rights and humanism and liberal values, these are just different words for Christian values. And sort of I guess that's the main point of his book, is that the modern world, the Christian world, is so much shaped by Christianity, and we need to be aware of that, because as other cultures are immigrating here, we need to be aware that we're expecting them to convert to those values, which, whether we call it a religion or not, is based in traditional religion. So he ended the book with sort of a personal story about dinosaurs and how he was raised as a Christian but lost his faith because he was like, well, wait, I know how old dinosaurs are, and the timelines don't really add up and anything. So it was kind of interesting because it went into more of a first-person storytelling viewpoint, whereas the rest of the book was written more like a history. So he acknowledged his cultural biases and talked about his godmother, and I mean, an absolute tour de force, if I can say so. It's got great pictures in it. At least this issue does. I think in the United States, it's the book is called something different, has a different subtitle, which I can't think of, but very interesting. Like, I really like the first part and the last part. The first part about the origins of Christianity, and the last part about more recent times and how these values have these traditional Christian values from 2,000 years ago have been so embedded in our society that despite all the revolutions and all the liberalization and secularization of our society, supposedly, we still hold to these values and ideals. It's almost like seeing it's like a pendulum swinging one way or the other, authority to individualism, to authority to individualism, and I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of history is like that, where we swing one way and then we swing the other way, whether it's politically, socially. Anyway, so that was Dominion. That was a big old book by Tom Holland. Very, very, it was a book.